Okay, I think we are live here. And if not, someone will stop me. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Jewish Digital Summit panel entitled, Should We Do a Podcast? Should we do a podcast? That question could probably occupy us for the next hour, and which it probably will. My panelists have come equipped with their podcast microphones, which is a very handy visual aid, so I appreciate that. If you've been wondering whether your own Jewish organization should be getting into the podcast space, this session is for you. My name is Andrew Lapin. I am a senior reporter with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. I also have a podcast under my belt. I am the host and creator of the show Radioactive, the Father Coughlin Story, which was a limited run series co-produced with Tablet Studios and the WNET Group's Exploring Hate. I'm very excited to welcome our two panelists today, both of them accomplished Jewish podcasters with very different kinds of shows for what I'm sure will be an insightful conversation. So we have Dr. Yosefa Rubel. She is the host of Matan's One-on-One Parsha podcast. She has a master's degree and is a doctoral student in the Bible department at Bar Ilan University, a teaching certificate from Herzog College, and a bachelor's degree in Jewish studies and creative writing from Yeshiva University. And a graduate of the sixth cycle of Matan's Bible MA program, a bridal instructor on behalf of Matan and the Eden Center, and a halacha consultant. And we have Dan Liebenson. He is the founder and president of Judaism Unbound, a digitally driven, radically open center for education, experimentation, and connection. He co-hosts the Judaism Unbound podcast, as well as the Oral Talmud, a streaming video program soon to be released as a podcast. Dan also directs and teaches in Judaism Unbound's Un-Yeshiva Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, which aims to empower a new creative class of Jewish lay people. All right, welcome to both of you. For everyone who is listening or tuning in at home, please feel free to input any questions you have into the Hop-In chat as we proceed. And we'll be monitoring those, and I'll look to incorporate your questions and insights throughout the hour. Okay, so to start off with, I think it would be best if we play a little how it started, how it's going vis-a-vis your podcasts. So I'd love to hear how and when did each of you first decide to start podcasting, and what has the experience been like for maintaining and growing the podcast and your audience. Dan, why don't we start with you?
So I'm always accused of asking like really complex and multi-layered questions. So now I'm glad to know that I'm not alone. Basically, we started the podcast about 7 years ago, and it kind of grew out of an attempt to write a book that Lex and I, my co-host, were trying to work on a book about the future of Judaism. And we were doing a lot of research and ultimately decided that we didn't quite have enough to write a book and needed to do more research. But so much time had already passed that I felt bad that we were going to, our funders, such as they weren't very many, but that they were not going to like the fact that we hadn't actually written the book and we had to do something. So we had the idea that we could kind of do the research for our book in the form of a podcast. And maybe people would be interested in that. Maybe we would be able to get more important people to talk to us because, they would think we're getting them publicity or something. And that was kind of the mindset. There happened to be a podcast that I really loved called The Critical Path, which was taking these ideas from the business world of disruptive innovation and applying them to Apple Computer Company, right? And I thought that would be cool to have a podcast that would apply those ideas to Judaism. And that was kind of the genesis of how Judaism Unbound started. And I think your question, we talk about it more, but basically I was always paranoid that we would lose our audience. So I always was afraid that if we took a single week off, our audience would all go away. So we have not taken a single week off in 7 years. We've released an episode every single week for 7 years. And that largely comes from my paranoia. And but it seems to be working because we've been pretty close to the top of the Judaism podcast charts the whole time. And we just recently crossed the 2 million listens threshold. So that's our cool recent. I think you asked about,
Wow,
the level. Where do you get to? But yeah.
Mazel tov. That is exciting. 2 million listens. Wow. Awesome. Yeah. Yosefa, let's go to you. How did you start making your podcast, and what has it been like to maintain?
Okay, so yeah, the story is definitely slightly different. I work. By the way, that bio, none of it's updated, but none of it matters. It's okay.
Right.
It doesn't matter at all. But the point is, for this purpose, is that I do have an affiliation with an institution called Matan, which is a women's Beit Midrash in a bunch of physical locations, but I work mainly out of the Jerusalem branch. And basically, what happened is that we had moved, and I was after trying living in a very different region. We moved back to sort of like the Jerusalem-based area, and I was actually looking to sort of revive what I had left a few years prior when we had left the area. And my husband actually said to me, I really think that you should try a podcast. I think that it would be great for all the, different skills that you have. And it was in the middle of one of the lockdowns for COVID, at least here in Israel. And basically, I contacted Matan. I was teaching for them virtually during that year, and I said, "Look, I have this idea. I have ideas also of what I would want the topics to be." It did not start out as a Parsha podcast, and basically, I learned that they had been given a donation and they had all this equipment sitting in their closet in the building and it wasn't being used. And so basically it was sort of like a perfect storm where I was sort of in a rare moment of life looking for a new project and they had sort of equipment available. So that's actually how it began. It began with me literally in like a tiny room once my children went to sleep doing it in my house, and it actually started off as a bunch of series. Our first we published the first episode came out in the 17th of March. I just checked in 2021. And it started out as a series, and that maybe gets like a different question of, well, what if you want to change your content and the concern about, people sticking with you or not sticking with you. But it started out as a series based idea. We had a bunch of series, and then almost a year into it, we actually switched to a Parsha base, and that definitely helped grow numbers as well. So that's sort of how it began. It began as sort of me looking for something to do, and then sort of growing into this role as podcast hosting. But anyways, there's more to the story, but I guess it starts there.
Yeah, no, that's really exciting. I mean, I'd love to hear if you want to elaborate on like why did you decide to shift to the Parsha podcast model, and how did that? You said that actually helped grow your listenership. You want to talk about
Yeah,
that?
I mean, look, Matan, its natural base is it's a women's Beit Midrash. So we're already talking about and it's Orthodox. Okay. So we're talking about a very niche situation. And so we already knew we were beginning with a niche concept, but we were trying to figure out how to grow even within that particular niche. And we toyed with different ideas. My field of research is really in Bible, so I wasn't going to make it like a Daf Yomi podcast, a daily page of the Talmud. And so we thought about different ideas, and I really have a tendency to like to go deep and longer, but I also knew that I wanted to again create bigger appeal. So we sort of ended up getting to this format of about it's 30 to 35 minutes. And I'm very, very careful never to go longer, but that I do go deep on the particular topic that we're doing. So we shifted into that, and it did. It just simply made it bigger. Initially, I started it was a little bit more women focused, and I wanted to shift away from that focus. I wanted to make it really available for everyone. And I appreciated those early series, and I loved those conversations, but they were just too small. The audience base was too small for it to be something that was really going to grow more than that. So yeah, we've definitely seen it grow over time, and ultimately I appreciate that. Meaning I appreciate that it's something that can appeal to a much bigger audience, and people like that it's short. It's not short so that there's nothing there. We pack a lot into 30, 35-minute conversation, but that format definitely is helpful for people.
Yeah, good to define short. I think in the podcast space for you,
Correct.
30 to 35 minutes considered short. Dan, what are the lengths of your podcasts? And since we're going to you, can you also talk about like as you said, you've been one of the biggest podcasts on the charts when it comes to Jewish shows, and can you talk about how that growth happened and like what you attribute that to?
So the length question, it's funny. In the early days, Lex and I had a debate about it because he's of a different generation. He's 20 years younger than me, and he felt strongly that the podcast should be short. And I felt that the podcasts that I listened to were about an hour. And so I felt comfortable that it should be an hour. And I think Lex felt that that was way too long. So I think we ended up compromising on 45 minutes. And it was based on no research, nothing other than just a compromise between us. And I think it has tended to drift a little bit longer than that over the years. My feeling was if somebody likes the podcast and it's too long, they can just pause it and they can listen to it again. So they can have like two podcasts for the price of one. So I'm not sure, again, I'm just making this up. I don't have real knowledge or survey data or anything, but it just feels to me that, I felt that what we wanted to do was get big ideas out. And if it takes a long time to get big ideas out, that would be okay. And that our audience would come along if the content was good. And so the question about how we've maintained success, I mean, again, part of the honest truth is I don't know, but I know what we've tried to do, which has been to be very clear about who our target audience is and to always make the podcast for that target audience. And that doesn't mean that other people don't listen, they do. And so our target audience is what we call the disenchanted but hopeful Jews, meaning people that are they are members of mainstream Jewish organizations, but they tend not to be that involved because they're not getting their needs met through them as they might have hoped. And then also people that are not affiliated with mainstream organizations, but that kind of still have a positive attitude towards being Jewish and want to find something that's meaningful. So that's our target audience. And my dad, who's a conservative rabbi, will often call me and suggest people that we should have on the show. And I'm always saying, Dad, you're not really the target audience for this show. Like, I appreciate that you listen to it because, your son is on it and that's really nice of you, but you're not really the target audience. And I think that if we pitched it at my dad, we would have a much smaller audience because that's not who we are. It wouldn't be natural. It wouldn't be organic. So I think there's a combination between you are your audience. So if you're creating a show that you would want to listen to, I think that that's a big part of it. And then also just being really clear on who your audience is and never varying from that. I mean, I think we can hopefully talk about it later. I think it's really important to the question of, should we do a podcast? Why are we doing a podcast? Do we have a reason for doing it? And if you do, then stick to that reason.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it sounds like, the answer is slightly different for each of you. I'm struck by, Yosefa, what you were saying that Matan already had equipment, built with the idea of maybe creating a podcast, but had just not done it yet, is what it sounds like you were saying. So, whereas I think, Dan, you were sort of starting from scratch when it came to figuring out how a podcast was going to come together. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What have the resources been like to make sure that you are able to put out and maintain a podcast, like in terms of equipment and staffing and all of that? How do you approach that? We can start with Yosefa maybe, and then go back to Dan.
Sure. What I've learned in my research on the topic is that the answer to this question varies tremendously. There are podcasts that are put out at much higher quality and podcasts that are put out at lower quality. There are podcasts that have higher degrees of editing and lower degrees of editing. So I'll speak to what we do, but it's by no means a recipe of anything particular. I will say that I am a very big stickler for sound. And so it happens to be that in the way that my podcast is set up and the people who I speak with, I actually often am sitting with them face to face, which is, I know there are podcasts that are wildly successful that they are never sitting in the same room. I happen to love that about what I do. And I've created a lot of relationships based on the people that I've had. And I know that a lot of that it happened also people I've only met through a screen, but I know that that's also a big part of it. So, In terms of how the staffing goes, or I mean, first of all, there definitely is money involved. I do it for an institution, so the institution itself is providing certain compensation for me as an employee, whereas other people can make podcasts and they are doing it on their own free time. So that's a difference depending on what the structure is of where the podcast is fitting in. Is it completely dependent? Is it part of an institution? Um, and I actually have, only because it was already purchased before, I have equipment for when I sit with someone in person, and I have online equipment. So right now I'm using my online equipment, which is not a big deal at all. But the microphones and the machinery for the in person is really simple to deal with, but it's a different set of equipment. But again, people could do it totally differently and totally lower budget. I will just say that how our editing functions is that I do all the content editing, and I do all the technical in the moment. I learned how to do it after a bunch of episodes myself. I had someone sort of handhold me through the first few, and then I was able to do it all on my own. And so I basically recorded someone. I send all the files to the editor that we use. They put it together, add music, add our intro, outro, and then I do another round of content editing after that. Send in, all of my corrections. Once in a while, there's another round, but usually that's really what it is, and that's sort of the whole process. I will say that over time, I've really perfected the process, meaning I basically edit as I speak to somebody at this point. Dan, you have so many more years behind you than I do, but that to me has made also the work much more effective. Meaning, as I'm speaking to somebody, depending on that, my conversations have different styles to them, and we can go into that later. I don't know if it matters for this session, but I basically do content editing as I'm speaking. I've gotten to the point where I already know where I want to put in musical interludes, like while I'm speaking to somebody. And a lot of that happens because I basically pre-plan with the guest beforehand. It's very not scripted, but I also over time came up with a system for how in the format we work, what I ask the guests to do before they come on. Different episodes require different amounts of preparation on my part. It really depends on how much they're bringing to the table. But basically, like as I'm working at this point, I'm already editing in my brain, and that's like sort of a skill that's developed over time. So that's sort of the system. It's a very, very small production. It's just me basically, and there's an editor, and I consult content wise with some of the people at Matan that I work with, but it's honestly it's sort of like 85% me with the editor as well.
It helps when the host already is doing the editing herself in terms of staffing, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not the technical. I do not do any of the technical, the filing. I just do the content editing.
Good to know. Dan?
It's interesting because we have had a little discussion over the years. Our editing is done by Lex, who's my co-host, who's I think in the chat. So if he wants to answer certain technical questions, he may be in a better position than me to answer some of those. But we've had this question of, should we, in the early days, we had no money, like literally no money. And so the idea that we could hire anyone to do anything was literally impossible. Over the years, as we've gotten more revenue in various ways, it's conceivably possible that we could hire someone to do the editing of the podcast. And we've had this conversation: should we do that? Would it materially change the podcast to have an outside person editing it? Like Yosef is saying, is it really important that one of us is the editor, because we can kind of do versions of editing as we're recording, and that's kind of important. So far, that we still haven't gotten an outside person to do the editing, largely for that reason. So that's one piece to think about. In terms of the equipment is extremely cheap, which is why we were able to do a podcast. Because again, the idea was that in the early years, we had no money and we wanted to do something with an impact. And really the equipment that we needed, because we already had laptops. So basically we needed $200 mics. And that was about it in terms of equipment that we didn't already have. And so that, by the way, is part of the problem of podcasting, is that because it's so cheap, I think a lot of people think, oh, no problem, I'll buy a mic and I'll have a podcast. And from a financial standpoint, that may be true, but I don't think for the most part that people will listen to that podcast. I think that you have to do a lot of work in editing in one way or another to have a show that people will want to listen to. So Josefa talked a lot about preparing in advance with the guest. We actually do very little advanced preparation with the guest. Our approach is that we record for about twice as long as the podcast actually ends up being. And so a lot of our podcast is shaped in editing by Lex, by chopping out the parts that didn't go as well or that weren't as interesting, or sometimes bringing parts from one place to another place and that kind of thing. And one way or another, I think the editing is a critically important part of a podcast being good. And I would say the last thing is just, I actually do think that we have gotten better at podcasting over the last 7 years. And during COVID, we started a project called Jewish Live, which was live streaming video. And I was on a number of shows that were not edited, that were just basically live to the internet. And I realized that over the course of then 5 years, like I had gotten better at this. And so I was able to do a live show that was unedited in a way that would have been terrible 5 years earlier. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I will just add from my own experiences in case anyone on the call is thinking of doing like more of like the heavily produced kind of Radio Lab, type of like really immersive podcast that for our staffing at Tablet Studios, we essentially needed like a period of crunch work with me and two full-time editors plus an administrative assistant, and like we were booking studio time for me because I didn't necessarily have that set up at home, and so that was a lot. That was like, and I could see that being a very big commitment for any organization that does not already have like a dedicated podcasting team. So I would just offer that as like a piece of advice in case anyone was thinking along those lines. But I'd love to.
Can I just add one more piece to that?
Absolutely.
Which is that, Dan, maybe at some point you'll get into how you've made the podcast more revenue producing. We have not gotten to that point yet. But the big thing about podcasting is that largely it's not a revenue producing project, again, unless you're getting to like the big wigs. And so there's sort of like a very clear built-in limitation to this kind of project that, especially if you're working through an organization, that you're sort of constantly aware of it, like on your neck kind of, right? Meaning this is a project that is fascinating as it is and intriguing and it's growing and people are listening. It doesn't necessarily mean that, getting to the point of ads or deciding to go in that route is a question in and of itself. So I think that in a lot of times I agree with you very much. And when someone can say, oh, I'll make it in my basement and it'll be fine. But I can record in my basement, but it sounds super because I have the right equipment and I have somebody, in our case, yes, somebody else doing it or whoever else will do it. And so it's just something to keep in mind that it's a particular kind of project. Look, a lot of people today, people are making music and they're not making money off of it. So it's a much more complicated endeavor in general. And it's something I think that it has to be reckoned with at some point.
Yeah. And I would just add, Andrea, that we have not made those highly produced podcasts that you're talking about for exactly the reason that you're saying. It would probably be at least 10 times as expensive to do. And we just either couldn't afford it or we would only be able to make like 5 episodes like that a year. And, I would be afraid that we wouldn't hold our audience. So we haven't done it, even though I'm desperate to do podcasts like that. And that's one of the balances that you have to strike.
Absolutely. Josefa, I'm glad you brought up revenue because that's definitely something that we wanted to touch on here. Some people might look at podcasting and see a revenue opportunity, but the truth is obviously a lot more difficult, as you were saying. Dan, you've had success in the revenue space. Do you want to talk about that?
We've had some success in the revenue space. When you said something in our preparation for this panel about that we were going to talk about revenue from podcasts, I said, is there revenue in podcasting? That I actually think for the most part, it's indirect, right? I think that people think that you can sell ads and make enough revenue for a podcast, but especially in the Jewish podcast niche, which is a relatively small audience, because we're one of the biggest podcasts. And I can tell you our numbers are not that big in the world. I mean, when you hear podcasts like Pod Save America talking about millions of downloads per episode, where we have 2 million podcast downloads over 7 years, and that sounds impressive, but it isn't compared to the world of larger podcasts. And when you think about how you make money from ads, it's a certain number of cents per per download, basically. And that just doesn't amount to much when you're talking about thousands of downloads per week as opposed to millions. And so the way that we've gotten revenue has been either through donors, foundations or other donors who have appreciated what we're doing mission wise. And that's a piece to think about. Like, we think that we're carving out a relatively unique mission in part of, I talked about who our target audience is, but our mission is really to get that target audience not to join existing mainstream Jewish organizations. I mean, if they do that, that's wonderful. We're not against it. But our idea is that Judaism needs to be reimagined, and that we're trying to attract people into a creative class of reimaginers of the next version of Judaism. And there are donors out there and funders who think that that's a thing that they're excited about, and they've given us some funding for that, although not really that much. It's actually been very hard to fundraise, especially from foundations, for that kind of work. And lately, though, we started a project called the Unyeshiva, which is online classes where we're really, and it's mostly so far we're marketing to our own listeners, and a little bit of people that aren't our listeners already, but we think it can grow. But it's actually the first time that we figured out a way to sort of monetize our audience, in the sense that people are actually paying substantial amounts, not for the podcast, but for the classes that we're teaching that kind of grow out of the approach of the podcast. So that's been an exciting development for us.
Yeah, that's really cool. All right, I'd love to jump into some of these questions. First up, from Rebecca Hirschwerk, who is considering creating a prayer podcast as an elective for our synagogue school students, and would love to hear any advice on working with kids in this realm. So podcasts as an educational tool, if either of you have either worked with students or children in the podcasting space, or have any thoughts about whether you think this is like a worthwhile endeavor, not as revenue, but as education and community building.
I mean, I'm an educator by profession. That's my main gig. But I haven't done it through a podcast. I think, first of all, it's worth thinking whether or not that age bracket are potential podcast listeners. That goes back to the initial question of who's our goal audience, and is this a relevant medium for them? It's interesting. I found that my main job is I teach 20-year-old women in a place called Migdalos. It's a women's Beit Midrash. And it's funny, I find that they do not listen to podcasts, whereas all of my peer group is listening to podcasts all day long. I mean, I love podcasts. It's such a main way that my husband, it creates so much conversation between us. And I find that these are just 20-year-olds. So I don't even know where we're going to if we get down, let's say, to, I don't know what age this is, 10, 11, 12, 13. So at first, I think it's really worth checking out whether or not they're interested in listening to this kind of medium. There's something about podcasting. I recently said this to somebody that is very countercultural today. You do have podcasts that are videoed, but for the most part, they're not videoed. And the other day I was listening to a podcast that I listened to kind of religiously, and realized I'd been listening for months and I had no idea what the hostess looked like. And I said to my husband, like, let's Google her. I won't say she's super famous. Everybody here would know who she is, but I should be embarrassed to know what she looks like until now. But and we were laughing because we've been listening. We talk about it all the time. It's such like a main feature of our life. And I had no clue, which is so countercultural today where everything is visual. So that's why I think it's curious to see, like, is it particularly popular with, millennials and up, or is this something that's relevant, to younger students? So that does not get at all to the question of the content, but I would first check that it's a relevant medium for them that they're going to be interested in. And definitely if there's no visual, it's going to have to be short because, people of our age bracket and up are listening on their car rides while they're folding laundry, on their way to work. But for kids, you have to think about what does their downtime look like, because podcasting is downtime. So maybe for them, it's the half hour where their parents let them listen, but they don't let them watch, So you have to sort of figure out like what's relevant for that age bracket. That's the first thought that pops to my mind.
Yeah, I like that. There's a funny, there's like a BuzzFeed article a while back that was like, what your favorite podcast and radio hosts, what you think they look like versus what they actually look like, which I think
yeah.
that's what you're getting at. Okay, well, Kat Manos has a question that I think is valuable for everyone. For an organization that may just be starting out in the podcast world, what metrics are important to consider to know if your podcast is valuable, or more to the point, whether it's working for your audience? So this doesn't necessarily mean high listenership, but how did you two know that what you were doing was working for what you needed to do?
Dan, why don't you go since I just spoke?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question because I think that there's part of it, and I think this is true for a lot of things, that actually it starts less with metrics and more with passion. I think that you have to, if you are loving making it, if you're loving how it sounds. It's funny, when we first started, somebody said to me, yeah, I don't know how you could make a podcast. Like, I can't listen to the sound of my own voice. And I said, actually, I kind of like listening to it, and I realized like there's just something about it. It's not that I'm like so egotistical that I like to listen to my own voice. It's just like, I thought we were doing something good and I enjoyed listening to it. And that was what was driving us. I think early on, we did have more listenership than we expected. It was relatively small numbers, but it was more than we expected. And so we thought of it as a great success. If I had taken those metrics to some funder, it would have gone nowhere. So I think you have to be very realistic. A lot of people come to me and talk about, should I do a podcast? And I said, and I say to them, the hardest thing about a podcast is to build and hold an audience. So if you are doing this because you think it would be cool to do a podcast, that's great. Then you should do it. But if you're doing it because you want to have a substantial audience and influence people, you are going to have to be in it for the long haul. And I don't think that you are going to get metrics early on that are going to confirm that you're doing the right thing for a while. And so it's going to have to, I think, come more internally.
Yeah, I guess I would want to echo some of that. Again, because I do this for an institution, there is significance for the people above me about the statistics that we garner. But I guess I would want to start with that last point that Dan made, which is that there are so many podcasts out there. And so no matter how amazing you are, it will take time to build up any listenership audience. Sometimes I'm sad about content I put out 2 years ago because so now more people would hear it. And so no matter what, I agree with that very much. The initial statistics, and when I say initial, it could be a year. Meaning, and the people I was working with had even like less of a clue about this than I did. But I said my intuition is that we really have to stick this out, okay? And we're going to have to keep going and see what's going to happen. But so I do look at the numbers. You can also, this by the way is an interesting way to interesting metric. I don't look at it because honestly it would just make me feel uncomfortable. But you can check a metric, which is at what point are people still listening to the episode? Meaning you can put an episode that's an hour, but no one listened after 35 minutes. And that's also a really interesting piece of feedback to get. So I do think that can be valuable. I do it once in a while just because honestly, it makes me makes me uncomfortable. A little bit too vulnerable there. But so that's one piece. I do look at the numbers and I have seen our numbers gradually grow. And that to me is a very, very affirming sign that I'm sort of touching a nerve with people. But I 100% agree that it has to be something in your heart, in your soul. And that's the only way it's going to work to begin with, whether or not it's reflected in your numbers. The other piece I'll say, and it also goes back to the revenue question, but actually for me, it's more connected to this one, which is that we have all of our episodes available for sponsorship. We've pushed it more as time has gone on. Again, because we're an affiliate of Matan, so you have all these people who are students of Matan or somehow students of Matan. And I did notice at a certain point that we got so many more requests to sponsor episodes. And so that to me was a very big sign that we're hitting a chord. And it wasn't happenstance. It happened while I did a series for this year for Braysheet that was all about family and interpersonal dynamics, which was by far my favorite set of conversations. And I noticed during the middle of the book that more people turned to us to sponsor. And I think that there was also something about the theme of it that people were like, oh yeah, sure. I'd want to, sponsor an episode in my grandfather's yard site or whatever it was. So that to me connects to the revenue piece because the sponsorship is important to us, but it also to me was sort of like a pulse, as a sign that people are listening. I do get some feedback. I ask for feedback all the time. I really appreciate that. So we do have an email where people can email us. It's rarely done, but people do get a hold of my cell phone and write to me. And I always assume that if someone's writing to me, they're usually not an outlier. So I take that feedback seriously.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just hearing from the community, do people like it? Do they appreciate it? Like that might be the best metric of them all.
I'll just add one other piece, which is that last week, my personal feelings about the episode were slightly more positive, and at the exact same moment, I got a SMS. We don't say that right now. A text. I got a text from a very good friend who said, not feeling the vibe this week. And at the exact same moment, I got a text from this rabbi who I know from my community who was like, I love Israeli. He also was listening to it in English, I guess, to challenge himself. He's like, I love this episode, like totally different. And that just made me, that was just a laughing moment. Okay. Like you can't please everybody, and different people like different styles. But that was just a funny moment of like literally the exact same moment I got a text from both of them. And they had very different feedback to give.
If I ever got a text from like a close friend who said they weren't feeling my podcast, I would probably like go find a hole somewhere and like crawl into it. So you're much better at taking critical feedback than
I love constructive criticism, and I agreed with her also, so I felt it.
I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here because there are a few around the practical applications of just kind of the simplest way to get up and going and how much training you need to do that. Like just sort of baseline. I think, I see a couple Shure microphones in the frame here, but is there a particular audio editing software that you use? Or is there was there some way that you trained yourselves on how to put it together and upload and monitor the metrics? What are the toolbox that people should know?
So Lex can probably put some things in the chat here, but we started with the microphones, and I still recommend them. There's a microphone called the Blue Yeti, and it costs about $100. It's a USB microphone, and it sounds good. So that, I think your podcast will sound perfectly good if you use a mic that's about $100. I think one thing that people on the technical side don't necessarily pay enough attention to is to be in a room that doesn't echo. Otherwise, it'll sound weird. So that doesn't have to be a studio or anything. It could be a closet. I know that NPR people just will put a blanket over their head. There's all kinds of things you can do. You just want to make sure that it doesn't sound like the sound is bouncing around, and you can just hear it in earphones and correct that pretty quickly. So that's the simple part. There's a piece of free software called Audacity that Lex uses to edit Judaism Unbound, and he's been using it for 7 years. I personally prefer another piece of software called Hindenburg, which costs a little bit more. And honestly, I don't know why Lex uses Audacity. No, I'm always giving him a hard time about it. But if you use an app like Hindenburg, it's really quite simple to do the physical work of editing, like to know how to cut things. You may need a little bit of training, but that's available on their website. They have online YouTube training. It's really, really very easy. So now, then you may have a few other things that are a little bit more complex, like how do you layer a little bit of music under it? But again, these are not very difficult things. So I think your average layperson who's good with computers should be able to figure out how to do the basics of podcast recording and editing pretty simply. And then the other piece on the technical level, and we didn't actually, when we learned this the hard way, we have a website. We had a website, and it was hosted with a website hosting service, a famous one. And we had the podcast. We were using their kind of blog feature to host the podcast, and it was used as something called RSS, which gets it over to Apple Podcasts or whatever. And then all of a sudden, when we got to episode 100, we started to see that we were losing our early episodes, and it turned out that our host only had the capacity to host 100 episodes. So we had to really quickly learn about how podcasts are supposed to be hosted by professionals. And then we found out that there are specific hosts that are really designed for podcasts, and they're not very expensive at all. We use one that's called Simplecast, and it's just, you just upload the file there, and you can host I think, unlimited number of podcasts. And again, it's not at all complex. It takes a little bit of time, but again, not a ton of time, like 15 minutes, I don't know, to upload the episode and get a little bit of description on there. So the mechanics are actually quite simple. It's just that you have to be committed to it. And really the time is in the editing. It's really about time. Are you going to put in enough time into the editing process to make a good podcast? To me, that's the difference between a good podcast and a not good podcast.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll also add a few things to that. As I said before, though, I'm not the one who does the technical aspect of it, so I don't. I was heavily involved in the beginning to get, as you said, a feed and figure out where to go. We also had the same thing happen to us, where we also lost our episodes, and then we realized we had to change our subscription. I will say that we use simply also because it was free, and Matan had already opened it because they put other content of theirs online. We use SoundCloud to upload. It's probably not the best out there, but that's what we use. But again, I don't even do that part. That's the office staff who puts that up, and in terms of equipment, I agree. As you said, I have the Shure microphone here, and I just really asked for advice from 3 people who actually were not podcasters, but they were sound professionals, and so that's where I started from, and I found them to be very helpful. The equipment that, as I said initially in my story, had been donated actually is annoying equipment. It's extremely high quality microphones that are really actually for a soundproof room, which is not what I work in. So I learned to make it work over time, but it works best because I have someone who's editing. Meaning, if I didn't have an editing staff, I would chuck that equipment and just use a simpler microphone because it actually makes your work much simpler. But I get to be a little bit spoiled like that. So I agree with that mic recommendation, and I can say nothing about the editing programs because I don't use them. So.
That's
yeah,
true.
and I upgraded to the Shure microphone during the pandemic just because I was kind of bored and I was looking for things to.
Oh, that's
entertain
considered
myself.
the upgrade? Okay, so that's what I started with from. Oh, but one other thing I will say, by the way, is that, so as I said, a lot of times I try my best to record face to face if I can, but when I do it online, I actually use a podcasting platform called Squadcast. And there's different versions. I was looking into a free version at some point, but I decided on this one, which does have like a monthly fee to it. I'm not even still sure that it's worth the money, but I hated uploading the I hate uploading the files. I do it when I record face to face, so I have it on a memory card and I upload it and send it to the editors. But when you do it through a podcast recording medium, so it's just you just copy a link, and I don't know, that for me just made the big difference in the timing and my brain space, and so to me it was worth it to pay a few dollars a month for that. But again, I asked around. I called up somebody else who had a podcast, asked them how they record online, and sort of like did my research and came to some conclusions. And then every once in a while, I rethink and I say, do we really need this? Is this worth the overhead? But again, I would say it's a system that works right now.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point to emphasize that, like, the higher quality equipment you have, the sort of like higher quality of skill set it demands in order to make it work for you. Like, if you have a really good mic, but you're not in a good recording space, it's going to pick up on that, and it's going to pick up on other errors that might happen. So that is probably not, these are probably not entry level, decisions to make necessarily. I really like this question from Rachel Goodfriend Klaus, and I want to spotlight it. Do you think a podcast is a good gap filler to create community? She says specifically within a synagogue. We can imagine this being in other Jewish communities as well. But podcast as a community building tool, whether for specific demographic groups or for other subgroups. We talked a little bit earlier about make sure people are actually listening to podcasts, but like even presuming that they are, and maybe Dan, with your live events, you can kind of speak to that as well. What is it like to try to build a community around a podcast?
To me, those are two different questions in a way, because there's what is it like to build a community around a podcast when the community doesn't already exist. So when we started Judaism Unbound, maybe naively, like I wasn't trying to build a community. It wasn't something that was I didn't want to be the head of a community. Like, it wasn't, I intentionally never became a rabbi. It wasn't how I saw what we were doing. But then it became clear over time that there were people who felt themselves kind of part of this Judaism Unbound community. And it was almost like their practice. People would write us emails that on Shabbat, instead of, they wouldn't have gone to synagogue, but they were taking a jog and listening to our podcast every Saturday morning. Like, our podcast intentionally comes out on Friday so that it can be somebody's Shabbat practice, so that they can have a Jewish Shabbat practice, even if they're not religious. And they were writing to us saying, I now call my morning run going to shul. And so there were ways in which that's not community, that's practice. But over time, we had a sense that people actually felt themselves to be part of this community and actually didn't know each other. And as we started to do various kinds of holiday events, and then ultimately the Young Yeshiva, more and more we're starting to feel like there's a community growing around this, that now actually the people, we're not mediating the entire community. They're people that know each other, and they chat with each other on these platforms that we have, and stuff like that. So that's one thing, but that took, 5, 6, 7 years. If you're talking about a small community like a synagogue, and you're saying, can we use a podcast as a way of building community within our synagogue? I actually would suggest not making your own podcast, because it's a lot of work for a relatively small and speculative return. I do think it could be interesting to say, let's adopt a podcast that fits with our community's approach, and let's have kind of a book club that talks about the podcast, or let's have something that jumps off the podcast, so that we don't have to have, in our synagogue, we don't have to have all the skills to make a podcast, and we don't have to put a lot of money. Maybe the money is really in the form of time into making a podcast just for our small community. We can actually use stuff that other people are making that have more resources than we do, or there's economies of scale there. So to my mind, that would be a better use of resources.
Yeah, I have to say, I really agree with that answer. I think that I'll give two very, very short, I don't know, stories. But as I said, my podcast base was starting from an organization. So there is a community, and it was sort of appealing to them initially. Now it appeals to a broad audience, but that was the initial piece. And just this week, I was speaking to somebody who works for a yeshiva in Israel, and he was saying that they have a WhatsApp group with 3,000 graduates of the yeshiva on it for Daf Yomi study. And he said that they've tried to do events, meaning this would be the okay, they tried to do events, and they had very few people that show up. There's something about these digital mediums that are not very commitment creating, that I don't think, again, I would really ask around. I'm a big, big fan of doing research, asking around, hearing from people's experiences. We're just two people. But I tend to think that it needs to either start from an already existing community, but I do not think that podcasts create community in that same way. I do think, by the way, that like YouTube channels have different results, but I think that podcasting a little bit different, something a little bit more slippery. It's not something that necessarily creates commitment from people. So I also am unsure that would be sort of the best way to go about it. And I also think ultimately for synagogues, people, they want to see each other. They want to see each other face to face. So I agree that maybe it's better to adopt some sort of project and create meetings around that.
The other thing, by the way, about a podcast is it's a really powerful technology. And I'm not sure, I can't come up with the right metaphor, but it's like, it's almost using like a jackhammer to nail in a nail into your wall. Like a podcast, the beauty of it is it goes national and international. And Lex and me, as two people essentially working in a basement with no money, can reach people everywhere in the world. And we have listeners in literally every country in the world. We look on the map and we have emails from people in Australia and everything. And it's almost like, to create a podcast for your small local organization feels like it's probably not the best use of that technology, because you're sort of like, if you're going to make a podcast for your small organization, then send it national, and then make a podcast that's going to bring the power or the approach of your organization to the whole world. Like, then I would say, yeah, then you should explore a podcast. If you're really just trying to do something small and local, it feels like there's probably better small and local technologies to use.
I really appreciate these insights. We only have about a minute left, but I want to thank both my panelists for being here. I see some great connections being made in the comments, which is lovely. And everyone listening can seek out my panelists Dan and Josefa through their podcasts, the name of which is under their names, and you can find them on Spotify and the like. So it sounds like an end result. Should we do a podcast? Maybe, assess it for yourself and see. So hopefully that helps people make their own decisions. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the summit.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.